For a long time, whispers had been circulating in church circles, but no one dared to speak them out loud. There were always quiet talks about Bishop Wooden and Juanita Bynum, yet nothing was ever proven, nothing was ever said directly. Both of them carried a strong name in the religious community, both known for their powerful sermons and influence. On the surface, everything looked normal, two respected figures carrying out their ministries, touching lives, and leading their followers. But behind the scenes, there was a growing tension that no one could fully understand. People who followed them closely had noticed the subtle signs. The energy between them had shifted. There was once a spirit of unity, but that unity was fading slowly, almost silently. Rumors spread quietly in church pews, whispered in conversations, and shared in hushed tones after conferences. Some believed there was nothing to the talk, that it was just jealousy or misunderstanding. Others insisted that where there is smoke, there must be fire. Still, both Bishop Wooden and Juanita Bynum maintained their public image. They continued to stand firm in their ministries, showing strength, determination, and confidence. Yet, the tension that had once been hidden was now beginning to push closer and closer to the surface. And the question was no longer if the truth would come out, but when. In the earlier years, Bishop Wooden and Juanita Bynum shared a bond that many admired. They were often seen together on the same platforms, preaching at major events, encouraging one another, and even publicly speaking with respect about each other's work. To their followers, it looked like they were partners in ministry who believed in the same vision and mission. People saw them as two strong voices who stood for faith, truth, and spiritual guidance. But slowly, things began to change. What was once a partnership began turning into silence. Where there used to be warmth and honor, there was now distance and coldness. They no longer shared stages as often as before, and even when they did, the chemistry that had once been so natural seemed to have disappeared. Those close to them started noticing the difference. There were disagreements behind closed doors about approaches to ministry, about personal choices, and about leadership styles. The unity they had displayed before was breaking apart, piece by piece. Both of them were strong personalities, unafraid to stand firmly in what they believed. And when two strong voices collide, it can create more conflict than peace. To the outside world, it still appeared as though everything was fine. Both continued their work, leading large gatherings and speaking with power. But insiders knew something was not right. What had once been an alliance was quietly transforming into a silent rivalry. Followers started questioning, what happened between Bishop Wooden and Juanita Bynum? Nobody had the full answer, but the tension was too clear to ignore anymore. In the beginning, their connection was seen as a blessing to the church world. Bishop Wooden was respected for his strong and uncompromising preaching style, while Juanita Bynum was admired for her powerful messages and her ability to reach people on a very personal level. When the two came together on the same platforms, it was almost like history was being made. People would travel long distances just to hear them speak, and many believed that God had joined their paths for a greater purpose. Their bond was seen as one of mutual respect and spiritual partnership, and for years, no one could imagine them being at odds with each other. But with time, cracks began to appear, cracks that, at first, were barely noticeable. Small disagreements surfaced during private meetings. They had different views on how ministry should be carried out, on how people should be guided, and on what direction the church community should take. While these disagreements seemed small at the time, they began to grow. For people with influence as large as theirs, even the smallest difference could create a storm. Some of their close friends and associates began to notice that they were no longer as close as they once had been. The warm greetings and shared laughter seemed to fade. Invitations to appear together became fewer. And when they did stand on the same stage, people whispered that something had changed. Their smiles didn't seem as genuine. Their words to one another weren't as full of excitement as before. The connection that had once inspired thousands was quietly falling apart. Privately, both of them carried strong convictions. Bishop Wooden was known for his strict, unwavering beliefs, while Juanita was more expressive and often spoke from a place of deep emotion and personal experience. These differences, instead of complementing one another, slowly turned into points of conflict. What once felt like balance now felt like opposition. Each stood firmly on their side, unwilling to. By this time, rumors had already started to spread. People close to the church whispered about private disagreements that sometimes turned heated. Some said it was about leadership, others claimed it was about personal decisions, and a few even suggested it was about trust. No one could confirm the truth, but the distance between Bishop Wooden and Juanita was becoming too obvious to ignore. Still, they both continued their ministries, and publicly they remained respectful. Neither openly attacked the other, but their silence spoke louder than words. Followers began to feel the shift, asking themselves, what really happened between them? How could two people who once stood together in faith now seem so far apart? And while no one had the answers, one thing was becoming clear: their relationship had changed forever, and the world was beginning to notice. As time went on, the distance between Bishop Wooden and Juanita Bynum was no longer something only a few insiders could notice. Their differences began to show in subtle but undeniable ways. Those who listened carefully to Bishop Wooden's sermons started to pick up on small hints, comments that didn't mention names directly but carried weight. He would speak about leaders who had strayed from the truth, about preachers who mixed emotion with ministry, about people who sought attention more than they sought God. Though no name was called, many in the congregation believed he was pointing toward Juanita. Juanita, on the other hand, never remained silent. Through her own platforms and sermons, she would also respond, but again, never directly. She spoke about men in leadership who wanted to control women in ministry, about those who tried to silence voices that God had called, and about individuals who misused their influence to push others down. Her words, filled with passion and emotion, seemed to many like a counter-response to Bishop Wooden's hidden remarks. It became a pattern that people couldn't ignore. Whenever Bishop Wooden preached on certain topics, followers waited eagerly to see if Juanita would respond. And whenever Juanita spoke on issues of control, authority, or personal struggle, people wondered if she was referring to him. The back and forth created a quiet storm within the church community. Behind closed doors, the disagreements were even sharper. Some insiders claimed that their differences went beyond ministry style. There were arguments about how conferences should be handled, how finances were being managed, and even about the way respect should be shown between leaders. These disagreements, once private, began leaking out into the open. The church world, always watching, began to connect the dots. What had started as small cracks had now become wide gaps. Followers were left in confusion. On one side, a bishop who stood firmly on tradition and order. On the other, a prophetess who believed in freedom, expression, and breaking barriers. Both had strong followings, both had influence, and neither was willing to step aside. It all came to a breaking point during a major church gathering. The event was supposed to be like any other, filled with worship, preaching, and encouragement for the people. But on that day, Bishop Wooden carried a different weight on his shoulders. Those who watched him closely could sense that something was about to happen, something far more serious than the usual message. When he stepped onto the pulpit, the atmosphere shifted. His tone was firm, his words sharper than usual. At first, he spoke generally, addressing the struggles of the modern church and the need for leaders to remain true to God's word. But slowly, his message began to narrow. He started speaking about preachers who, in his words, had allowed personal ambition to take over their calling. He spoke about individuals who used emotions to manipulate crowds rather than deliver truth. And then, for the first time, he spoke a name, Juanita Bynum. The congregation gasped. Some leaned forward in shock, others exchanged looks of disbelief. Many had suspected for months that his subtle hints were directed toward her, but now there was no denying it. The veil had been lifted. Bishop Wooden declared openly that Juanita's teachings and actions did not line up with the truth he stood for. He accused her of confusing people with emotional performances rather than guiding them with sound doctrine. His words carried power, but they also carried a heavy weight. For some, it felt like courage that he was finally saying what others were too afraid to speak. For others, it felt like betrayal. After years of partnership and respect, how could such accusations be made so openly in front of everyone? That moment marked a turning point, not only in their relationship, but in the church community itself. The silence that had surrounded their disagreements was shattered. No longer was it about hidden hints or quiet whispers. Bishop Wooden had drawn a line in the sand for everyone to see. And as the congregation sat in shock, one question lingered in the air. Why now? Why, after all this time, had Bishop Wooden chosen this moment to expose Juanita Bynum? When news of Bishop Wooden's public statements reached Juanita Bynum, she could not remain silent. For years, she had carried herself with grace, keeping her disagreements behind closed doors. But now that her name had been spoken openly, she felt she had no choice but to respond. Her followers were waiting, the public was watching, and silence would only make it look as if she had something to hide. Juanita addressed her supporters during a special service, her voice heavy with emotion. She began by acknowledging the pain she felt. "I never imagined," she said, "that someone I once shared ministry with would choose to tear me down in front of the very people we were called to serve." Her words struck deep because many still remembered the days when she and Bishop Wooden worked side by side, uplifting each other. She strongly denied the accusations made against her. Juanita insisted that her preaching was not about performance, but about passion, that her tears and emotions were not an act, but the overflow of a real journey with God. She reminded her audience of her struggles, her broken seasons, her personal battles, her testimony of pain and healing, and explained that everything she spoke came from a place of truth and experience. "I don't preach to entertain," she declared. "I preach because I've lived what I speak." But Juanita didn't stop there. She turned the spotlight back on Bishop Wooden, questioning his motives. She asked why he had chosen to attack her now, after years of ministry. She suggested that perhaps his words were less about truth and more about power, more about controlling the narrative and protecting his own influence. Her response wasn't filled with direct insults, but it was clear she believed Bishop Wooden was using her name to build himself up. Her supporters erupted in applause, standing to their feet in agreement. Social media lit up with clips of her response, with hashtags flying and debates breaking out everywhere. To many, she was not just defending herself, she was standing up for every leader, especially women, who had ever been silenced or disrespected. Juanita's side of the story brought a new wave of emotion into the conflict. She positioned herself as someone who had been wronged, but was still choosing to stand strong. And in that moment, she gained even more sympathy from those who had already loved her. But for others, her response only added fuel to the fire. They questioned whether she was being truthful or simply trying to protect her image. And so, instead of ending the drama, her response only deepened the divide. Once both sides had spoken, the church community and the wider public found themselves completely divided. What had started as quiet rumors had now turned into a loud and very public battle, and everyone seemed to have an opinion. For many, Bishop Wooden's boldness was refreshing. They praised him for finally speaking the truth that, in their minds, had been hidden for too long. These supporters believed he was protecting the church from deception, standing as a voice of integrity who refused to remain silent. They admired his courage, saying it took strength to call out a name as well known and respected as Juanita Bynum's, On social media, his followers posted clips of his sermon with captions like, "Finally, the truth is out," and "Bishop Wooden is fearless." But on the other side, Juanita's supporters were just as passionate. They saw her as a victim of betrayal and believed that Bishop Wooden had gone too far. To them, Juanita was a woman who had already been through enough struggles in life, yet she continued to stand tall and preach from a place of authenticity. They felt her tears, her passion, and her pain were genuine, and they accused Bishop Wooden of trying to destroy her character for his own gain. Hashtags defending her trended online, and people flooded her events in a show of solidarity. The division grew sharper by the day. Families inside the same church argued over who was right. Longtime friends found themselves disagreeing. Some churchgoers stopped attending services altogether, not wanting to choose sides. Others switched their loyalty completely, either following Bishop Wooden more closely or pledging their full support to Juanita Bynum. Even pastors and leaders from outside their circles began to weigh in. Some urged for reconciliation, reminding everyone that the world was watching how Christians treated one another. Others, however, chose sides openly, deepening the divide. It was no longer just about two individuals. It had become a larger conversation about leadership, respect, and accountability in the church. The conflict had grown beyond the pulpit. It was now in the headlines, on social media,